Hello and welcome to the Plutarch Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Cox from Grammaticus.co, and today we're going to dive into the first Spartan life. Buckle your seatbelts because Sparta will make you feel uncomfortable no matter where you're coming from. Lycurgus, the first Spartan life we do, is the founder, the mythical founder of the Spartan polis. So for everything that made This Is Sparta famous, for everything that makes gun owners put the Molon Labe on the back of their trucks, this is the man who started it all. This legendary lawgiver has been admired by diverse people, Plutarch, Rousseau, but even Joseph Stalin. So it's interesting to see his impact, and that's, I think, more important as we talk about these legendary lawgivers. The impact of their story on the men and women of the centuries that lived after them is more important than the historical niceties of whether or not they existed. For the same reasons that whether or not chariot warfare in Homer was exactly as Homer describes it, with plenty of time to smack talk for hundreds of lines before throwing your spear, doesn't matter. What matters is that the poem Homer gave us presents us with a story that we have to accept, deny, admire, peruse, reflect on, ruminate over, and not something that we need to get nitpicky on. So I will occasionally tell you certain things about Lycurgus that are probably historically later or maybe historically never happened. But I hope that that's not the main focus of this podcast, because I don't think it's the main focus really of reading Plutarch. We don't just read Plutarch solely as a historical source, although he's a very useful one. We really read Plutarch for many of the same reasons we read any biography, which is getting to know people and letting them have an influence on our lives, especially people that we would never otherwise know. So let's dive right into this Lycurgus guy because he's crazy. So Lycurgus was the son of a Spartan king. So the Spartan kingship traces its lineage back to Heracles, his Greek name. You may know him by his Roman name better, Hercules. And all of the Spartan kings claim descent from the sons of Hercules. So there's two Spartan kings already. And Lycurgus is a younger son, so we don't expect him to rule, but then his brother dies, and at the same moment, he finds out that his brother's wife is actually pregnant. So there's a tension immediately at the beginning of the life between, should I rule because I'm old enough, and I'm the brother and the next in line, next of kin to the king, the now deceased king, or should I make space for this baby to rule because he is going to replace me? Am I willing to be replaced? Is the question that Lycurgus has to ask. But his sister-in-law has her own plans and tries to seduce Lycurgus, saying, look, I'll marry you, we can have our own rightful offspring, and I'll kill this baby, abort this baby while it's still in my womb. So it's a strong start to put Lycurgus in this moral situation right at the beginning of his life. This is a pretty bold introduction, and don't worry, it's only going to get bolder. Lycurgus then tricks his sister-in-law and leads her on thinking, you know what, rather than abort it, that would, be a danger to your health. You'd have to take all these chemicals. It would be uncertain. Why don't we just expose it on Mount Taygetus when the baby's born? This is standard procedure for the Greeks. Infanticide was a normal option for pagans who treated the children particularly as property of the father. If the father disowned it, it was put out on a mountainside. Now, there's a flip side to this coin where we notice in almost every myth that you leave a child out on a mountainside, the child is adopted by some couple who can't have children and turns around and fulfills his destiny still. The two most famous examples of this are Paris, whose parents know the prophecy that he will destroy Troy, and so they leave him out on a hillside. Well, we know that doesn't end well because he's still raised up, and by the time we see him in the Iliad, he's back as a prince of the royal household in Troy. And the other famous example is Oedipus. You leave him out to die, someone else raises him, and then because he hears a prophecy about his mother and father, is confused and thinks his mother and father are the man and woman who are not actually his biological mother and father, but his adoptive mother and father. So we have this really intense beginning, and when Lycurgus is told about the baby's birth, he grabs the baby, saves it, names it. The fact of naming it, picking it up, was often in the ancient world the recognition of the legitimacy of that child. So he names it Karileos, which is the joy of the people. So they have a future king. This will be particularly important anytime there's a monarchy, but you can think of really famous monarchs who were desperate for male offspring, Henry VIII being the most famous. And Lycurgus is not put in that position. He's glad to welcome his brother's son into the world. But as he tries to rule as regent, there's a great deal of envy incited, and so he has to go away. This is very similar to two other stories that we've heard. We remember in the life of Solon that Solon makes his laws first and then travels, so that he can let his laws sink in. Lycurgus has to travel at the beginning, and so there may be an element of Lycurgus's travels teaching him something, making him a better lawgiver or a better leader. The other Spartan who famously travels is the Spartan who travels home from the Trojan War, Menelaus. Menelaus is the victor of the Trojan War. He's coming back with his prize, and yet he tells the story in the Odyssey of just exactly how crazy his return trip was. He ends up on Egypt, he has to wrestle Proteus, he makes a stop by Crete, and while his return journey is not quite as difficult as Odysseus's, it certainly foreshadows Odysseus as Menelaus sits around and tells Telemachus, who's visiting him specifically looking for news of his father. So we have two famous journeys, and actually, though Lycurgus doesn't go to Egypt, he has two important stops that are similar to Menelaus and Solon. He stops in Crete, and in Crete he learns that poetry can make good laws palatable. He even sends one of their poets back to Sparta to start laying the groundwork for his laws, as Plutarch tells us. And then in Asia, which we should be clear is just the modern country of Turkey, and really probably the western third of it, mostly the coastlines on the west and south. In Asia Minor, or Anatolia as it's called by the Greeks, he compares Cretan Greek lifestyle, which he calls simple and severe, and Plutarch tells us is healthy, with the Asian lifestyle. And this doesn't mean Asians, right? This means all that live on that coastal region I just described, as extravagant and permissive. So whether you're a Greek speaker or someone in the remains of the old Hittite and Assyrian Empire, the land east of the Aegean Sea, which we'll call Asia Minor or Anatolia, is associated with wealth and pomp and glitz and show. We saw that when Solon arrived and saw Croesus. But we know historically that this has some elements of truth. The very first culture to start minting gold and silver coins was the culture of Lydia, under the king of Croesus, who was later conquered by Cyrus. And then the Persians take the idea of the gold coin and the silver coin, and they spread it far and wide over the largest empire yet known up to that time, the Persian Empire. So there's an element of truth in it, and it's not all bad. He discovers the poems of Homer in Ionia, in that west coast of Asia Minor. And the poems of Homer are going to jive so well with what we'll later discover is the Spartan lifestyle, because the height of virtue is military glory. Think of Book 5, when Diomedes, with the help of the gods, basically goes on a killing spree. Or when Achilles finally enters in the later books 20 and 21, I think, but don't quote me on that. He kills more people in those books than any single hero had killed in all the other books combined. Maybe Patroclus, if you count Patroclus's 3 strikes against 7 men each, can match him. But that's the idea. Lycurgus is the one that brought us Homer. We have Lycurgus to thank for Homer, which is interesting because in the historical record, it seems that we have Athens to thank for the fact that we have Homer, because it seems like one of the earliest editors and proponents of the Homeric poems was actually the tyrant Pisistratus, who ruled right after Solon. But either way, we know that the dates we're working with are pretty spot on. It's about the 8th century BC, around the same time that the Olympics restart, 776, that the Greeks pick up and start spreading, first through memorization, and then ultimately it's written down, the poems of Homer, the two of which survive are the Iliad and the Odyssey. So Lycurgus at this point has returned home, and when he gets back, he's resolved to rewrite the entire Constitution. Probably mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again. The Constitution is not a written document for these people. Solon did write down his laws, and he wrote them down as poetry, and he posted them publicly. But Lycurgus has a different method. Because he knows that poetry and memory are so closely linked, he's going to write his laws in verse and not write them down. I should say, he's going to compose his laws in verse, and he will not write them down. The idea behind this is that he wants them written down in the hearts and minds of the people, and not written down in some place where they can be ignored and reinterpreted and thought about. So he goes to the temple of Apollo, and Apollo gives him his blessing, calling Lycurgus more a god than a man, and prophesying that he will create by far the strongest and best of all constitutions. That's a big deal because Plutarch is dropping this at the beginning of the life, and we know that the gods have approved. Their stamp of approval is something that Plutarch, as a pious Greek, is going to take seriously. As a matter of fact, Plutarch, remember, is a priest in the 1st century AD at the Temple of Delphi. So he takes Apollo very seriously, and the fact that Apollo approves of Lycurgus, and he drops this early on, means that he's writing a check that he's now going to cash for the rest of his life. So Lycurgus gathers together a group of 30 friends. They take over the marketplace, the agora, the central gathering place for all business and politics, and he starts his legal changes immediately. We get that number 30. 30 men then become the council of elders that Lycurgus will rely on for advice. They become the balance to the king. They become the aristocratical or oligarchical element of the government to balance the monarchy. Sure, you had 2 kings already, but now you're going to look to your geron, to your old man, and you're going to make a council of elders called a gerousia. When we get to the life of Numa, we'll see that the Senate is the exact same etymology in Latin as the gerousia is in Greek. Geron means old man. You might be familiar with the branch of medicine called gerontology, right? The study of aging. When you get a bunch of gerones together, you call it a gerousia. You turn it into a feminine abstract noun and boom, there you got it. The Romans do the same thing. They gather together a bunch of elders. Seneces. When you get them all together, you have a senate. And that's where that word comes from. The other aspect and another important rule here is that as he creates the council of elders, he's given a great retra from Apollo. And a retra is a word for speaking. There are so many words for speech in Greek, even more in Homeric Greek. It's one of those verbs for speaking that by the time we're in the classical period of Greece, they are a verbal contract with sacred force. So a retra could be between 2 people, but it's like calling God, or the gods, I should say, as a witness to what you are binding yourself to. They're also the name for most of the utterances of the gods to men. So they have a force that brings about their will behind them. Something like Oedipus's, you're going to kill your father and marry your mother. A scary thought, but one that pushes and forces its way into Oedipus's life, even as he tries to avoid it. They're not to be ignored. They can't be trampled over lightly. They can't be dismissed. And so these retri are really going to be treated as laws from the gods themselves. So we've gone from Apollo approving to Apollo actually being involved. The great retra from Apollo himself is this idea of the mixed constitution. The idea that Sparta will be in perfect balance, in harmonia, right? The Greek word for harmony. And that balance is going to be 2 kings, which inherently balance each other. You can think of it as one for foreign policy, one for domestic policy, or one to be ruling at home while the other is on a military campaign. But it allows the executive to function in more than one place at a time. Then you have the gerousia. That's the legislative body, the representatives of the greatest old men. We're going to see what it's like for a man to be elected to the gerousia and how important that is to the whole polis. And at least for Plutarch, he also adds the 5 ephors. And these are guys with mostly veto power that balance the tyrannical tendencies that could crop up when you give power to just 30 men. 2 kings and 28 members of the gerousia, total the number of 30. So his second great retra, his second great law with sacred binding force, is the redistribution of the land. He really wants the purpose to be to end jealousy, vice, and luxury. And as a matter of fact, you could see the Spartan laws as a war on those 3 things. Almost every law can be brought around to, does this end jealousy? Does this attack a certain vice? Or does this prevent luxury from sinking its roots into the souls of Spartans? And we should remember that there's really 3 levels of society that we're dealing with here. If you are a citizen in Sparta, male or female, you have a very specific role. As a woman or a man, your job is to be strong. That strength has slightly different ends. As a woman, you want to be strong so you can give future Spartans to the Spartan polis. As a man, you want to be strong because you want to be able to fight and win in battles in your phalanx. You don't want to be the weak link. Phalanxes are probably only as strong as the weakest man who gets pushed back. So if the Spartan can ensure that every single man in their tight-locked, shields interlocked formation, then they're in good shape. Underneath the homoioi, the equals, as they call themselves, are all of the unequals. They do not play a prominent role in this life of Plutarch, but I want to give enough political background so that we feel like we walk away with a clear picture of the Spartan constitution. The ones never mentioned in the life of Lycurgus are the perioikoi. Those are the ones that are going to have to do all of the necessary things to keep a polis working. You cannot have a city when everyone is a soldier. The perioikoi are going to be the ones that make the wooden furniture, that oversee the slaves in the field, that ensure that the animals are fed and tended to, that make shoes, that make shields, that make swords. All of these things are forbidden by law from a Spartan participating in. A Spartan citizen cannot be a sword maker on the side, cannot be a shield manufacturer on the side. He must, full-time, be dedicated to being a Spartan warrior for the polis. The perioikoi are the free, maybe free is too strong a word, but are those that live around. That's what oikoi and peri mean. Peri is around, oikoi is the word for house or dwelling. Those that live around the Spartan area who engage in procuring and making whatever the Spartan soldiers need. And under them is the helots. Helot is a word meaning seized or grabbed. So there's an etymology there that's a little more violent than the etymology for servus in Latin. The normal word for slave in Greek is doulos. We'll see that word used a lot in the New Testament, right? St. Paul calls himself a doulos of Christ. We actually even have the English word doula, for those of you who are familiar with the growing movement of having another woman around to help during birth. That woman's actually called a doula. Servant could be a fine translation as well, but the original meaning of it would have been slave in Greek. But they don't use the word douloi in Greek. They use the word helot, which comes from the verb hyreo, which means to seize or grab. And there's a way in which we get the image of the Spartans having seized this territory from Messenia and forced everyone into slavery in an I own you where you are sort of way. So helots are not bought and sold. Helots are not, moved around the Mediterranean world. Helots are specifically Spartan slaves. They're born slaves. Their offspring are slaves. They die slaves. And they die serving the Spartan constitution, serving a Spartan master. So, as I said, the citizens, the actual equals at the top, are forbidden from using coins. They're forbidden from practicing a trade. Nonetheless, we might see both of those as impossible. Okay? Supposedly, Lycurgus can replace coins with iron bars. We should remember that we are at an early enough time that currency and coin currency is pretty young. So the idea that he could banish it and they would go back to or maybe subsist on more barter-like situation is fairly likely. More likely, I think, than we would admit with our modern economic obsession. It wouldn't necessarily be a good thing for Sparta, but it's more possible than it probably sounds to the modern ear. He also forbids them from practicing a trade, but it does mean that the tradesmen are limited even in what they provide. So if I was a goldsmith, I wouldn't have a place in Lycurgus' constitution. I work with gold and silver, and that's too fancy. He doesn't want any of that. But if I make really good chairs or really good cups, and I consistently make really good cups, then I'm welcome as a perioikoi. And so one of the parallels this reminds me of in modern life is that idea of like military issue as being a higher quality or consistent quality that can be counted on. You can think of the Marines who swear by their K-bar knives, or the M16 and its civilian equivalents, right? The AR-15, I think. Somebody can correct me in the comments if I'm totally off there, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. And then we finally get to the third major retra, the third major reform, which is these common meals. Sometimes you'll hear them called common messes. The Greek word is syssitia, which means eating together, or really food together. It was a fixed menu. You basically had a few options. It sounds very similar to the modern Mediterranean diet, but there was very little meat unless you hunted it. So the staple was black broth. There was bread, olives, cheese, and oil. And because everyone ate in public and everyone ate together, there was no push for fancier tables and fancier food and private cooks. Even the kings ate with their cohort of 15 men. And so Plutarch tells a story where he says that Plutos, wealth, is like he is depicted in the pictures. He's blind, lifeless, and still. And right after telling us that wealth is blind in Sparta, has no purpose, doesn't work, Lycurgus loses an eye. The rich really don't like these common meals, and in one of the kerfuffles over it, a guy named Alcander knocks Lycurgus in the eye. It's unclear as to whether Lycurgus loses the eye or loses sight in the eye. There's some swelling, but Alcander's punishment is to serve in Lycurgus's house for a number of months. And it's strange, but Alcander comes to serve Lycurgus and ultimately even to love and respect Lycurgus as a man, calling him one of the greatest Spartans. And then Alcander goes on to live as the most well-mannered and wise of the citizens of Sparta. Alcander's name, by the way, means manly strength. So there's a way in which he could be seen as a symbol for all the Spartans. I might be reading too far into that, but so you have your cohort. Everyone contributes food. The kings have to dine with their cohort. Children are invited so that they can learn self-discipline. This is a key Greek word here. In this conversation about virtue, we're really working so late in the Greek tradition, we're 600 years after Plato, that we have a clear knowledge of what the four virtues are that Plato and Aristotle had sort of hammered out and handed down to us. And they are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. By the end of Plato's life, in the Republic and then later in the Laws, he makes very clear that prudence should be the highest and most important of the virtues, the mother and model of the virtues, and Aristotle agrees with him. Plutarch and a lot of the later inheritors of the Platonic and Aristotelian tradition really struggle with this. And so the question becomes, what really is the hierarchy of virtues? But it's interesting that the children go to these common meals in order to learn what was translated in my translation as self-discipline, but is sophrosune, is that word for prudence, which you can obviously see is related to the word sophos for wisdom. So there's an element of practical wisdom is sometimes one of the definitions of sophrosune. So they learn self-discipline in two specific ways. They learn that what happens in the common meal stays in the common meal, and they learn how to take a joke and to give one. So if you have an image of the Spartans as like a dour Scottish person or something, like cheap, skinflinty, and simple and puritanical, you're wrong, right? The Spartans loved to laugh. They just didn't have to talk much to do it. As a matter of fact, that's what they're most famous for, is their witty barb that makes you laugh. So how do you join a cohort? You join a cohort where everybody squeezes a piece of bread, and a squeezed vote is a yes vote, and drops it into a basket. You need to be unanimously selected, so 14 people need to vote to add you to the cohort so that you can become the 15th man. And if they don't, you get basketed. You don't get a cohort, you live in public shame for a while, and when the next cohort opening comes up, you hope that everybody squeezes that bread in the basket. There are some minor retras that we should run through real quick before we get to the agoge, which is definitely the main focus of what makes Sparta different, is how they train their children. And this is maybe becoming 2 episodes, but the agoge is super cool and very interesting. Maybe I find it really interesting to teach because I teach 8th graders, but they can really see themselves, gosh, would I ever go through that? Would I put up with that? How would I ever be okay with that? So the culture, again, is a challenging one to take on. The 3 minor retras are, don't write these things down. This is where we get the sense that education is more important than law. It's not about writing a law down and filing it away somewhere, or posting it up somewhere and making sure everybody knows what it is. They need more than just a knowledge of what the law says. They need a knowledge, experiential, of how to live the law. And that's what Lycurgus wants for all the Spartans. The other 2 are that they are forbidden from using fine tools to finish their wooden instruments. So their houses must be built with just the axe and the saw. You can't have a plane to make sure that you get these nice square beams, finely polished, nicely sanded. There's that element of Spartan simplicity that comes out all the way down into their laws. Don't build your house with anything fancier than an axe and a saw. And the last one is don't fight consistently against the same enemy. There are a number of times, actually, in Spartan history where this seems quite wise, because the Spartans will consistently fight against someone. Their enemy seems to glean a sense of the Spartan tactics and then can do better than the Spartans. The most famous example of the Spartan embarrassment is by the Thebans at the battles of Leuctra first and then Mantinea, as the Spartans utterly lose power just before the rise of the Macedonians, and the Thebans become the number one military force in Greece. He then goes on about laws about marriage and childbirth. Those are very strange. Again, I'll just say that the comment is primarily to fight jealousy. So there is a man and a woman in a marriage, but there is not a sense that wives cannot be shared willingly. That is an odd one. Okay, this makes this a very much PG-13 sort of life. The other ones are childbirth, which the laws are fairly straightforward, except that there's this strong emphasis that the parents aren't the primary caretakers, aren't the ones primarily responsible for the child. The polis is. The polis of Sparta. And that's where it's okay. 0 to 7, sure, you can be raised in your home with your mother, but once you turn 7 years old, you become the property of the state. Does this sound at all like required kindergarten for anybody? No. I laugh, but I really should be crying. The agoge is exactly that. The state takes over the education of your son, and that's all of the men become like fathers or uncles. All of the men are laser focused on your son becoming the perfect Spartan hoplite. And I think it just emphasizes exactly what the relationship is between all these lawgivers and education. That is, they really see law and education as one and the same. Either you are educated by the laws or you're educated for the laws so that you can fully participate in whatever polis you've been born into. We're going to primarily be studying two things that don't seem to fit Lycurgus himself, but rather the focus of the latter half of the life of Lycurgus is the society he created. The Sparta that he created that lasted for hundreds of years and was undefeated in battle until the Thebans embarrassed them publicly. And so there's two elements of that. There's sort of the beginning and the end. The beginning is called the agoge. That's the training period. That's what turns a young boy after the age of 7 and up to the age of about 18 into a Spartan citizen, into a full-fledged citizen soldier, willing to fight, win, and die for Sparta. The second aspect is the end. It's those 28 men who get elected to the Gerousia, the influence they have, the authority they have, and the way that in representing the best of Sparta, they show us a lot more about what it means to be Spartan. And so what are the elements of the agoge? Well, they're kind of cool. Some of them are fun to talk about, and some are really sad. So the boys are put into military squadrons, and they eat, play, study, and exercise together. The best boy is given leadership. He's put in charge. And as Plutarch says, this has the natural result that the entire education becomes training in obedience. The question I ask is obedience to whom and why? But so the older men will make sure that the boys fight in order to test the boys' courage, their character, their spirit, their resolve. They want to see them in action fighting against each other. But it's typical of the way boys fight. The fight often breeds more respect for the other boy after you're done. They only learn enough reading and writing to get by, and they really want them to learn to obey, to learn indifference to hardship and pain, and to fight to win. Those are Spartan virtues. By the age of 12, they are only allowed one outer garment in the winter. I looked up the average low temperatures for Sparta nowadays, and it gets to about 39 degrees at night in the dead of winter, the coldest month. It's January. They're not allowed to bathe, and they have to make their own beds and sleep outside during that time. Well, that's going to make any 12-year-old I know pretty tough. All men, as I said earlier, consider themselves fathers, tutors, guardians of the boys. There is never a time when the boys can't be watched or corrected by an elder, by an adult in the room. But there's also an official, superintendent of education. He's in charge of the entire agoge process. And he's called the paidonomos, which means the lawgiver for the children. By the time you're 20 years old in this process, you're put in charge of a larger number of those smaller boys' groups or squadrons. And you have to command them to gather their own wood to make their own fires and steal their own food. If you're caught stealing, you were beaten and you weren't given the food. So that the lesson that you were supposed to derive from that was that you should steal better next time, and you shouldn't expect a handout. No one is going to give you anything. My question at this point is, if Plutarch admires this so much, did he raise his own sons this way? We know that he had 3 sons, but Plutarch also says that too much good food when you're young prevents the growth of tall men, weighs you down. I'm not sure we agree with that anymore, but it's interesting to think about. Some other things from the Agoge is that young men would rather die than be caught. There's a boy who's ripped apart by a fox that he's hiding because he wanted to steal it and get away with it in secret. And so he holds the fox close to his chest and stomach, and the fox literally rips the boy apart and he dies. Another one is the seize the cheese, I call it. This is my name for it, not Plutarch's, but they would roll the cheese or put a cheese at the end of in a temple or somewhere where the boys knew that they could get it. And then they put 2 lines of boys on either side, and you had to run through the gauntlet of boys who could beat you, whip you, trip you, and do anything they wanted. And you just needed to be tough enough to get to the cheese. Yeah. So after dinner, they would also sit around at the Syssitia, right? They would sing songs, answer questions, and they would engage in dialectic. Remember, this is really, Plutarch at the end of the day is a student of Plato and is a philosopher. And so this idea that they engage in dialectic for the betterment of their own souls, Plutarch is a big fan of. The Spartan ideal is to be concise, to the point, well-reasoned, comprehensive, and persuasive. Don't say more than you have to. If a boy falls short and says something stupid or wordy or not worth hearing, they bite his thumb. It's not so bad. That seems actually like the lightest punishment so far. But the other leaders are watching and looking on and watching over each other to prevent excessive punishment. But then Plutarch gets into the laconic style. Laconia is the name for the region around Sparta, and their speech patterns become so famous that even in English, we have the adjective laconic, which means to pack a lot of thought into as few words as possible, or to have a simple, pithy speech full of valuable ideas. And that's where we get to that molon labe that I mentioned on the back of people's trucks. There's some great stories that will be shared in other lives, but I'm going to just tell a few here because they're so fun, about the Spartans' ability to respond to questions. They thrive in that short, pithy, punchy response to a question. And a couple that are really famous occur right before the Battle of Thermopylae as the Persian host is marching down, and they're so large they're drinking the rivers dry as they pass through them. They send messengers to the Spartans, and one of the messengers from Xerxes says, "Our arrows will block out the sun." And the commander's response is, "Good, we'll fight in the shade." The last time Xerxes sends his messenger and says, "Hey, lay down your arms." And the Spartan response is, "Molon labe, come and get them," which is exactly why Second Amendment rights advocates are a fan of molon labe. It's punchy, basically means having come, take, right? But come and get them, I think, is the best translation of that. So we get into this laconic style, and we even get some of Lycurgus's laconic retorts. They would be best suited for Twitter, right? They're very short. When someone asks Lycurgus why he didn't make a democracy for his polis, he responds with, "Well, why not try it in your family first?" Oh, somebody asks him why they give small sacrifices to the gods. He says, "So that we don't run out of things to offer." And when somebody asks him what are the best exercises for men to get super jacked like a Spartan, he says, "All of them, as long as they don't end up in you raising your hands." Get it? Surrender, raising your hands above your head. Ha! Good job, Lycurgus. And then when asked, "Hey, how can we defend ourselves? What's the best way to keep ourselves safe?" He says, "Stay poor and don't want more than your neighbor has." Wow. That's powerful. Archaeologically, this is attested in the record. Sparta is not nearly as interesting archaeologically to dig up as other poleis like Thebes and Argos, Epidaurus, Corinth, although Corinth is a Roman city because it was burned to the ground. But Sparta is pretty small. It looks and feels small even to the archaeologists who dig it up. The last thing is he's asked, why are there no walls around Sparta? He said, "The best defense is a wall of men, not stones." There's another famous report. Plutarch and Xenophon both loved to just compile Spartan sayings. It was almost like a way you could meditate on proverbial wisdom. And one of the Spartans, when asked that question, why doesn't Sparta have a wall? He just pointed to his spear. He didn't say anything. implying this is Sparta's wall, right? My spear. So Plutarch gets so carried away with this. He loves like the laconic retorts so much that he just keeps going. And he talks about Leonidas, whose response when somebody says something clever but totally irrelevant is, you hit the bullseye on the wrong target. When people ask Charolaeus, the boy that was born at the beginning of this life, Lycurgus' nephew, when they asked him, why do the Spartans have so few laws? He says, men of few words need few laws. And there's many more. But one of my last favorites is, how many Spartans are there? And the response was, enough to keep the evil away. Boom. So he goes on and he shares some jokes and some poetry and song, but then we get into how the Spartans march and prepare for battle. And this is sort of when they relax the belt. It's right before they go into battle. So they're famous for their long hair, and there's a Persian messenger who notices that right before battle is going to begin, the Spartans are basically fixing their hair, which really surprises the Persian general who's about to fight against them. But Lycurgus' thoughts on long hair are also pretty funny. They make a handsome man more handsome, and they make an ugly man more terrifying. So, hey, bonus, either way. We either want handsome soldiers or terrifyingly ugly ones, and long hair serves both purposes. They relaxed their training, went on campaign, and they are known for their piety. So one of the links between Lycurgus and his parallel Numa Pompilius is that they seem to bring the gods directly into the lives of their citizens, which I'll just call piety for shorthand. But the Spartans become famous in other historians like Herodotus and Thucydides for being unwilling or unable to engage in a particular war or battle or problem because they're celebrating a festival and they need to focus on the god or the festival at hand. So when the Spartans march, they slaughter a goat, they crown themselves with laurel, they play the flute, and they march calmly and joyfully into bloody battle, as it says in my translation, and they engage the enemy without fear or frenzy. So this is where we get the idea of the Spartan military machine. They pursue only to cement the victory, so they don't need to kill them all and let the gods sort it out. They immediately want to withdraw. They don't want to lose more men than they have. When we did the life of Aristides, we saw Plutarch's respect for the Spartan general Pausanias during the Battle of Plataea, when Pausanias would not start that battle until the omens were right, to the point that the tallest Spartan lost his life while Pausanias was still trying to get the omens, and famously dies saying something like, I regret only that I couldn't fight for Sparta, that I died not fighting. One other aspect of the Spartan lifestyle is their freedom. So it's hard to talk about the scholae, or the free leisure time that the Spartans have to do things like dialogue after dinner, to do things like train for hours and hours a day. They don't have to do anything else. They work full time on the virtues necessary for making them great warriors, even when they're not at war. So if wealth is worthless, as any Spartan worth his salt would say, and work is for slaves, then they don't have to worry about making a living. They're convinced that anybody who works hard to make his living is really just a slave. He's just not a slave to a human master. He's a slave to money. There is an element of wisdom in there, and you can see something to admire, even though the entire Spartan system is built on complete control of the slave class. The young men and the older men guard their free time so intensely that they don't end up going to the marketplace at all. They have nothing to shop for. What do they need? They're either at the gym, and remember, gymnasium is a Greek word, or they're with their syssitia, right? Their club, their cohort. So they're either training, or they're eating, or they're dialoguing. Lycurgus says this makes them unwilling and unable to live without each other, and then he compares them to bees, where everyone lives with a hive. There's a few anecdotes that he tells, and then we get to this election of a man for the Gerousia. So when you are living as a citizen in Sparta and one member of the Gerousia died, everybody who's over the age of 60 is eligible, and the Gerousia puts together a group of contestants. They then gather the assembly of all the Spartan soldiers. So this is the closest we see to the democratic element. If you fight for Sparta, you can vote in Sparta, but you're really just voting for the wisest man to be involved in the leadership and legislation of the day-to-day. So the assembly comes together, and there's a group of men that can hear but not see what's going on. And as each of the contestants walks by, the way of voting in Sparta is not with pebbles like it is in Athens or with pot shards like it is in Athens. It's by shouting. The length and the level of your shout decides who you're voting for. Which reminds you of just one of those amateur comedy acts or something where they hold the $10 bill over the head of the person and whoever gets the most cheers gets the $10. Seems kind of strange to me, but then that man who is elected, the man who earned the loudest and longest acclaim, he's escorted around the city to the gods of all the temples by the young men and the women singing his praises. He goes to his syssitia, to his cohort meal, and eats as normal, but he gets a second helping. He has to set the second helping aside, and when he finishes his meal, he offers it to the most noble woman in the polis. So it's cool that when electing someone to the Gerousia, the whole polis is trying to find who is the man we respect most over 60. And then that man helps the polis see who is the woman that we ought to respect the most right now in the whole polis. It doesn't seem that there is an age limit on the woman being chosen. So he could choose somebody who was 25 or 35. So anyway, I think that captures so much of what the Spartans are trying to do with their lives. The story continues with how to bury the dead. Their familiarity with death makes them unafraid of it. That's a very important thing for a soldier. Spartans are forbidden to travel. So we get the exact opposite of Solon and the Athenians. Remember, Solon and Romulus, these guys had made their city a place for refugees. Sparta says, go away. You're not one of us. Lycurgus calls foreigners worse than the plague because they introduce principles contrary to Sparta. So then we get into a willingness to critique the laws. But Plutarch really wants to critique the laws but defend Lycurgus. So this is hard for him. One of the ways he's going to do that is by introducing the most disgusting law, the Crypteia, and then not blaming Lycurgus for it, saying that it's a barbaric custom that was introduced later. So what is the Crypteia? Crypteia, you may know the word cryptic or crypt. It means secret or hidden. It was this way of sending out the young men during their agoge training, right towards the end. It was in some ways considered a capstone. And they had to kill a helot secretly and not be discovered. So the helots, when they walked back from the farms or from their long day of work, wherever it was they were coming from, and walked back to their homes, they knew that at any moment, basically, they could be jumped by a Spartan teenager and killed as a rite of passage. Whenever an ephor is elected, one of those 5 guys with veto power, they, as part of their oath, declare war on the helots. This is to make it so that whatever a Spartan does to a helot isn't considered murder. So they have a systematic and almost a religious way of dehumanizing the helots to make them fully aware that they're property. I mean, at this point, Plutarch even tells the story of Thucydides where they take the helots who have served the best and the most bravely in, the helots often go to war as assistants or helpers in the camp, and those who have served best at home in the field or wherever they are, and they crown them and bring them around the city, and then all of those helots who were chosen as the best disappear. They're killed. And so it was a way for the Spartans to select the best and prevent them from becoming the leaders in a future revolt. So there's other cruelty to helots. They'll often force them to become drunk so that the Spartans can see how ugly drunkenness is. And finally, Plutarch closes with I think one of the most powerful quotes in the life of Lycurgus, that there was no one more free than the free Spartan, and no one more enslaved than the Spartan helot. And Plutarch just finds it hard to believe that the gods would ever approve of this. And so he says, clearly, they didn't and couldn't. But his reforms take root. Let's say he doesn't do the Crypteia and he does everything else that we've mentioned so far. Plutarch really approves of a number of things that we would struggle with, particularly in the laws of marriage and, depending on how you understand the pederasty relationships between older men and younger men, there are a lot of things that would sit uncomfortably with us. But as I said, these reforms take root, and Lycurgus decides it's time to leave the stage. He goes to Delphi, double checks if there's anything else to do, makes the Spartans swear that they're going to keep the laws until he returns, and then starves himself to death so that he never returns. So very different than Solon, who just asked them to keep the laws for 10 years as an experiment, and then if they still like them, they can keep them. But Plutarch makes the point that from Solon, we're going to see several more reforms of the Athenian democracy, and it's really going to change almost every generation after Solon, including tyranny immediately after, and then ultimately democratic restoration in a more extreme form what Plutarch admires the most is that, at least according to him, the Spartan glory and the Spartan constitution live on for 500 years, which finally ends under King Agis during and after the Peloponnesian War. So he's going to blame Lysander, which is an important other life that we'll get to in future seasons. Lysander is the first one who brought the greatness and wealth of conquest into Sparta, and so ruined them by introducing, you guessed it, jealousy, vice, and luxury. We also get, I said it was a great beginning. I think there's a really awesome end here to Lycurgus' life, because he really wants to emphasize exactly how much influence the Spartans had. He says when the Greeks ask the Spartans for help, they don't ask for money, they don't ask for ships, and they don't even ask for soldiers. They don't want Spartan mercenaries. They want Spartan generals. The Syracusans ask for Gylippus. Agesilaus serves in Egypt. Lysander serves in Asia Minor. Brasidas serves up north in Amphipolis. And then the Spartans will also send out, for the small time that they are running an empire, the Harmosts, which comes from, according to Plutarch, harmazo, to harmonize. They need to harmonize the elements of balance. And so Lycurgus looks to create a polis that finds that harmony. And so he ends really powerfully by critiquing one of his intellectual heroes and forebears. He says that even though Plato, Diogenes, and Zeno, three famous philosophers of three very different schools, agree with Lycurgus on so many aspects of government, the only thing they left behind were books and lectures. And Lycurgus left behind a polis. And so there's an element where, even though we will admire the philosophers that influenced Lycurgus or Numa or Pericles or Dion or Brutus, those are some of the lives I can think of where a philosopher plays an important role in the education of that man. In spite of that, those men who produce great polis or encourage great citizens are the ones that deserve more credit than Plato. That about wraps it for this double-wide episode on Lycurgus. There's so much more that could be said about Sparta, but I hope this was a really good introduction to Lycurgus and his reforms. Remember, you can find more information about the podcast at grammaticus.co/podcast, or you can go to plutarch.life to find a specific episode. If you already know you're looking for one, you can put in plutarch.life/Lycurgus, for example. You can leave a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts, and I would also love to hear any questions you may be having as you struggle with reading or teaching Plutarch. You can contact me at grammaticus.co/contact or tom@grammaticus.co. Thanks for listening, and I hope I've inspired you to open Plutarch and let his lives affect yours.